A bitter wind lashed at the host assembled beyond the gates of Castle Black, and in that wild wind lay the promise of darkness. Torches sputtered as the men struggled against the gale, and the already falling snow thickened to a swirling curtain of white. Under that swirling canopy, countless figures trudged onward, black brothers of the Night's Watch and wildlings side by side, accompanied by the banners of various northern houses who had lent their arms to the cause. It was an unprecedented alliance, born of desperation rather than love. Yet for all the grudges, resentments, and unanswered debts, no one could deny the necessity of unity now that the dead had come. Jon Snow, newly recognized as Lord Commander, led from the front. He rode a brown Garin, a horse bred for the cold, though it snorted its discomfort at the biting temperature. His black cloak, emblazoned nowhere with rank, for the Night's Watch had no lords save their Lord Commander, swirled behind him, marking him as a beacon. Men who looked upon his figure in the darkness saw not only a young man with a Valyrian steel sword, but also a symbol. A watcher on the walls, a negotiator of peace, and if rumor were to be believed, one of the few who had faced a White Walker and lived. Closed by rode Ygritte on a sturdy mare she had insisted on taking from the wildling ranks. No southern warhorse for her, no docile mount from a stable's gentle breeding. Her mare was a shaggy beast that kicked at any stranger who tried to approach, but with Ygritte astride, it moved through the snowdrifts as though this was a routine journey across the wastes. Her hair, that telltale blaze of red, was tucked beneath a fur hood. She glanced about, her blue-gray eyes sharp, scanning the thinning horizon for any sign of movement. Though her lips were pressed tight, an observer might have caught the flicker of apprehension in her gaze. It wasn't fear. Ygritte had faced too many horrors to be frightened easily, but a knowledge that no skill with a bow could wholly defend against what lay ahead. Tormund Giantsbane was easy to spot, even in the half-darkness of a near-eternal twilight. His red beard was like a beacon of its own, and the roar of his voice carried above the wind. He bellowed orders and insults in equal measure, urging free-folk warriors to keep ranks, to hold formation. That in itself was a novelty. Wildlings were never ones for formal discipline. But these were not ordinary times, and Tormund's presence had helped shape them into a band that could, at least, march together and follow rudimentary signals. Ygritte could hear Tormund from where she rode, and the sound of his voice brought a small measure of comfort. Where Tormund ranted, morale tended to rise. She knew that all too well. They had set out with some 600 fighters. Not a grand army by the measure of southern kings, but large enough to be unwieldy in the deep snow. The free folk made up nearly half the force. Raiders, spearwives, hunters, and clan leaders who had agreed to come together for the fight. The rest were men of the Watch and soldiers from the north, wearing cloaks of mottled gray and furs marked with sigils. Bears for House Mormont, swords for the Karstarks, pine trees for the Glovers, and a handful of other minor houses. Stannis's own men were stationed further east, protecting the approach from the Bay of Seals, or so the last ravens had indicated. In the swirling storm, communications were unreliable at best. Their mission was simple in concept yet harrowing in practice. They marched to meet the threat that advanced from the Shadow Tower's direction. Reports of Whites and White Walkers had trickled in. Small skirmishes where men were simply overwhelmed by the dead. The scattered survivors told stories of the night itself coming alive, of the wind turning so cold that breath froze in throats. Jon had weighed their accounts, and the council at Castle Black had agreed. To wait behind the wall might mean letting the dead breach it, if there was some hidden key to that unholy magic. Better to meet the foe in the field, harry them, and slow them long enough for Stannis to bring in further support. As they rode, the sky seemed to darken further, as if the night was deepening prematurely. The swirling snow took on a faint luminescence, reflecting the thin sliver of moon. Now and then, men looked up at the wall to their east, a sheer mass of ice that stretched impossibly high. It loomed as a silent guardian, glistening under starlight. But that ancient fortification offered scant comfort. If the undead forces truly sought to cross, the wall itself might be tested in ways unseen since the Age of Legends. They pressed on, winding through a narrow valley. The wind died here, though the cold did not. Jon raised a hand, signaling the columns to halt. Ahead, an outcrop of rock offered a vantage point. He dismounted, motioning for a few scouts to follow. Ygritte quickly joined him, scanning the landscape with her keen eyes. They reached the outcrop carefully, the snow nearly up to their knees in places. When they emerged on the other side, the view of the valley opened before them. At first, it looked like an ordinary stretch of white-capped land, dotted with patches of skeletal trees. But as Jon's eyes adjusted, he noticed strange shapes at the far edge, dark lumps scattered in the snow. He squinted, straining to make out details in the dim gloom. Ygritte froze at his side, her breath hitching. Bodies, men and horses perhaps, or something else. The lumps were too rigid, too still. Jon raised his hand again, signaling the scouts to fan out and approach carefully. Ygritte nocked an arrow, though she knew that if White Walkers lurked among those shapes, she would need more than one arrow. The tension among the group crackled. Behind them, Tormund's distant roars grew quieter as he kept the columns in check, not sending them forward until Jon signaled. Jon and Ygritte, along with 2 rangers and a free folk scout who called himself Grauf, inched closer to the shapes. A sickly stench wafted across the breeze. Rotting flesh or something even more foul. The lumps were indeed corpses, arranged in a line as if frozen in the midst of flight. Some were half-buried, their limbs contorted. The horses, if such they were, seemed decayed beyond normal measure, as though time had rotted them decades in a matter of weeks. Ygritte grimaced. She had seen death before, many times, but there was an uncanny aura to this place. She knelt by one of the corpses, arrow at the ready, but it did not stir. "Feels like they were just left here," she muttered. Jon stooped beside another, turning it gently to see if it wore any identifiable sigil or sign. Beneath the crust of snow, he caught the glint of chain mail. "Night's Watch," he said quietly, spotting the black garb that had turned a faded gray from exposure. He swallowed hard. Whether this was a patrol from the Shadow Tower or a group that had gone missing days prior, these men were his brothers. The emptiness in his chest was tempered only by the knowledge that the bodies had not risen yet, though that small solace did little to calm the dread in his mind. A sudden rasp made them all freeze. One of the corpses moved, a slow, shuddering motion. The Free Folk scout jumped back, hissing in alarm. Immediately, Jon stood and drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel shining with the moon's reflection. Ygritte braced her bow, dragging her aim onto the corpse. Its eyes opened, revealing milky white orbs. A shudder traveled through its limbs, and with a startling jerk, it rose. The white stumbled to its feet, tatters of black cloth hanging from its frame. Another form near it twitched as well. Soon, more of the seemingly lifeless bodies quivered, stirring as an otherworldly chill swept the area. Panic spiked. One of the rangers cursed, plunging his sword into the white's chest. But the undead creature scarcely reacted, only staggering slightly before snapping its jaw in a silent, grinning snarl. The ranger had to yank his blade free before the white's hand clawed for his throat. Ygritte released her arrow, the obsidian tip striking the white in the head. It collapsed into the snow, but even then, a horrid wriggling continued in its limbs. Another arrow pinned its neck, and at last it lay still. The second reanimated corpse lunged for Jon, who brought Longclaw down in a savage arc, cleaving the white's torso in half. The stench of rotting innards spilled into the air, turning Ygritte's stomach. The Free Folk scout, Grauf, slammed a dragonglass dagger into the skull of a third white that had been crawling toward them on all fours. They made quick work of the immediate threat, calling for the others to torch the remains. But if these were outriders for the army of the dead, it meant that the main host would be close. Jon stood amidst the carnage, breathing heavily, and felt the weight of inevitability settling upon him. They didn't have much time. The whites were massing. Every minute spent out here in the open was a risk. Jon signaled for the others to form ranks. The standard bearers rode forward, their banners snapping in the gusts that snuck through the valley. Tormund cursed loudly when he saw the rising smoke and realized what they'd found. Shouts spread through the columns. "Whites! We have whites!" Men clutched their weapons, many of them fumbling with torches or fire arrows. The lessons hammered into them by the Night's Watch were simple. Fire, dragonglass, or Valyrian steel were the only sure ways to stop a white or its masters. In the swirling confusion, Ygritte found Jon again. "They're near," she said grimly. "It's never just a handful of them. Where one is found, 100 more wait." Her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd survived Hardhome and the terror of the undead onslaught. Jon nodded. "We form a defensive line here. If they come at us, we'll have the vantage of the slope behind us. Tormund, you take the free folk on the left flank. Mormont's men on the right. The watch in the center. We'll try to draw the whites in and burn as many as we can." He paused, jaw tightening. "If white walkers appear, we concentrate our best weapons on them. Longclaw, the dragonglass arrows, whatever we have." Ygritte's throat constricted. "That's assuming they come from one direction. They have an uncanny way of surrounding you." "It's the best we can do," Jon replied, voice low. "We can't outrun them in this weather. Our best chance is to stand and hope the fires hold. If they're truly a horde, we'll only slow them, but that might buy time for reinforcements to arrive from Castle Black or from Stannis's host." She set her shoulders. "Then we stand." Quickly, Jon and his lieutenants arranged the lines. Men with bows, both black brothers and wildlings proficient in archery, took position on the ridge, braced against the wind, ready to fire flaming or dragonglass-tipped arrows at the first sign of movement. Pike-bearers, some free folk but mostly Northmen, formed the front row. Others stood ready with swords and axes. In the center, small braziers were lit so that torches could be replenished, offering a flickering pool of light in an otherwise desolate darkness. The hush that fell over the valley was eerie. Snow muffled sound, and visibility was poor as night settled deeper. The scattered chunks of white corpses had been torched, but the smell lingered, a nauseating reek that clung to hair and clothing. Tormund, pacing at the left flank, muttered to himself about the unnatural quiet. It was a sentiment shared by all. Even the men's breathing felt loud, and the stomp of restless horses was a jarring reminder of the tension. At length, a figure appeared at the far edge of the valley, a silhouette at first. Then more joined it. Human shapes, half lumbering, half stooped. Ygritte narrowed her eyes. These were whites, no doubt, many of them wearing the ragged remains of clothing from no single uniform or style. Some had once been wildlings, others crows, perhaps even northern villagers. They advanced in a slow wave, as though drawn by the scent of the living. A ranger on the ridge loosed an arrow tipped with oil-soaked cloth, ignited by the brazier's flame. The arrow soared through the air and struck one white in the chest, setting it ablaze. The creature stumbled, screeching soundlessly, then collapsed. The unnatural quiet of their approach was soon replaced by the crackling of flame, and abruptly, the rest of the whites broke into a lurching, horrifying run. "Steady!" Jon's voice rang out across the lines. "Archers, loose!" A volley of arrows hissed overhead, a mixture of plain arrows doused in flaming oil and some tipped with dragonglass. They peppered the front ranks of the whites. Several collapsed, limbs flailing as flames consumed them. But still they came, unstoppable in their mindless hunger. Men tensed, bracing for impact. A cluster of whites slammed into the pike wall, impaling themselves but still clawing forward, forcing the living to wrestle their pikes free to thrust again. Ygritte stood behind the pike line, rapidly firing arrow after arrow at close range. Her wounded shoulder ached fiercely with each draw of the bowstring, yet she gritted her teeth and continued. She refused to let her injury hamper her now. If she faltered, the entire line could buckle. Beside her, a free folk spearwife named Cora hurled short spears into the writhing mass of whites, while cursing the undead in a shrill voice. The combination of curses, the stench of rotting flesh, the heat of the brazier fires, and the swirl of snow made the scene almost surreal. From behind, the Night's Watch archers unleashed a second volley, setting more of the horde alight. Flames danced across the battlefield, reflecting in the eyes of men who had never imagined facing such horrors. The Whites' shrieks and moans filled the night, and shadows flickered as torches were tossed among them, igniting the oil-slick ground. Parts of the valley became a sea of fire, though the bitter cold subdued some of the flames before they could truly spread. Suddenly, a new sound sliced through the clamor, the keening cry of a White Walker. It was high and thin, like the wail of a wind through a hollow pass, but with a cold malevolence that made men's hearts lurch. Heads turned as a tall, gaunt figure stepped forth from the darkness, a creature seemingly carved from ice, its eyes shining an otherworldly blue, carried a spear that glistened with frost. Behind it loomed two more, each armed with a deadly weapon forged of ice. A hush of dread rippled through the living ranks. Jon felt his mouth go dry. He'd faced a walker before, slain it with long claw, but each time he saw one of these beings, the primal fear returned. The White Walker raised its spear, and a sharp, cracking sound tore across the battlefield. Another wave of Whites emerged, as if summoned by that signal, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. "Jon," Ygritte called, knocking a dragonglass arrow. "I'll try to bring one down." She raised her bow, aiming at the White Walker's chest. Her hand trembled from pain and from the cold, but she forced herself to steady. The arrow flew, slicing through the snow. At the last instant, the walker twisted impossibly fast. The arrow grazed its icy armor and shattered upon contact with the ground behind it. Ygritte cursed under her breath. Jon took a breath. "Archers, concentrate on the White Walkers," he bellowed, though chaos made it hard to be heard. Tormund was already storming through the lines, hacking at the Whites that threatened to break the flank. He roared a challenge at the nearest walker, but the creature regarded him with an almost lazy contempt. Tormund flung a torch at it. The walker sidestepped, and a rim of frost spread across the torch, extinguishing its flame before it hit the ground. Tormund's eyes went wide. Across the line, Lady Mormont's small contingent of bare-helmed warriors held their ground, stabbing Whites with sharpened pikes. The lady herself was at Castle Black, too young to march in such a brutal battle, by her bannerman's insistence, but her men fought with the fierceness of their sigil. A swirl of snow nearly obscured them, and then the White Walker's spear rose again, letting out another crack. A biting wind gusted, as though the cold had been given claws. Men screamed as frost coalesced on their swords, their armor, their very skin. The White Walker advanced upon the center of the line, unstoppable. Jon forced himself to move. He clutched Longclaw in both hands and waded into the sea of Whites, hacking them aside. Their limbs fell away, but more reached for him, bony fingers scraping at his cloak. Each time he swung, it was as if he were cutting through layers of ice. One White, a massive northern man in a half-frozen bearskin cloak, latched onto Jon's shoulder from behind. Jon twisted, bringing Longclaw around to sever the creature's head. Through the swirling snow, Ygritte's fiery hair marked her position. She kept pace with Jon, releasing arrow after arrow into any White that threatened to flank him. One tried to rush her from the side, but she spun and drove a dragonglass dagger into its eye, her lips curled in a snarl. Still, her focus remained on the White Walkers. She knew that as long as those pale masters stood, the Whites would keep coming in unending waves. In the fray, the first walker turned its icy spear upon a group of Mormont men. The spear's tip glowed with a pale blue radiance, as if channeling the frigid night itself. With a fluid gesture, it smashed the spear down, and the men's weapons broke upon contact, their steel snapping like cheap tin. One of them attempted to strike with dragonglass, but the walker sidestepped again, inhumanly fast, then drove its hand into the man's chest. Frost rimed the soldier's armor, and he collapsed in a rigid spasm. Jon grit his teeth and rushed forward, Longclaw raised. The walker met his charge, spear clashing with Valyrian steel. A piercing clang resonated across the battlefield, turning heads. For a moment, the White Walker regarded Jon as if recognizing him from some distant memory. Then it pushed forward, forcing Jon back a step. The cold it radiated was palpable, numbing Jon's hands even through his gloves. Still, he held on, forcing Longclaw against the spear in a deadly dance. To Jon's side, Ygritte managed to find a line of sight and fired another arrow, this time aiming for the walker's exposed flank. The creature heard the twang of the bowstring and whipped around, bringing an arm up just in time. The arrow grazed the walker's side and left a faint crack in its icy flesh, but it did not shatter completely. A howling hiss escaped the walker's mouth, and it shifted its attention to Ygritte, flinging its spear in her direction. Jon saw it and reacted on instinct. He heaved Longclaw upward, just barely managing to deflect the ice spear from its lethal path. The spear skittered across the ground, sending a spray of snow as it ricocheted. Ygritte rolled aside, heart pounding, and tried to knock another arrow. Unarmed, the White Walker still closed on them with unearthly grace. The temperature around them dipped further, making the air painful to inhale. Jon took a swing at the walker's torso. The blow connected, fracturing a portion of the ice-like flesh. The walker let out a shriek, one that resonated in the bones of every nearby fighter. Pieces of icy shards fell, but the walker did not collapse as others had when struck by dragonglass. It recoiled, then lunged with clawed hands. Jon had to dodge, stumbling over a half-burned White's remains. Tormund, seeing an opening, charged in with an axe that Sam had hastily fitted with a Drago. Glass edge. With a bellow, Tormund brought the axe down on the walker's left arm. The ice cracked, and the limb snapped off, shattering on impact with the ground. Still, the walker persisted. It swiveled its head toward Tormund, blue eyes glowing with hateful intelligence. Tormund swung again, but the walker's remaining arm lashed out in a wide arc, knocking Tormund's axe aside in a spray of ice. Tormund fell back, swearing, the breath forced from his lungs. At last, Ygritte found her moment. She focused, ignoring the pain in her shoulder, ignoring the chaotic swirl of the battle around them. She drew back an arrow she'd carefully prepared, dragonglass, fletched with crow feathers Sam had given her. The walker was turning toward Jon again, raising its stump of an arm as if to conjure some final, cold assault. Ygritte loosed the arrow. It soared true, a black streak through the dimness, and struck the walker in its exposed neck, right where the ice had fractured. The walker froze in all senses of the word, its shriek catching in its throat. A spiderweb of cracks spread from the arrow's impact. Time seemed to pause. Then the walker exploded into shards of ice, collapsing into a sudden heap of frost. A hiss like escaping steam arose, and the creature was gone, leaving only the faint shimmer of the arrow's black tip among the icy dust. For a heartbeat, Jon, Tormund, and Ygritte all stared, hardly daring to believe it was over. Around them, men were still fighting Whites, but the tide had shifted. With the White Walker destroyed, many of the Whites collapsed abruptly, as if strings had been cut. Others wandered aimlessly, easy to dispatch now that their controlling presence was gone. A few still fought with savage fury, possibly bound to other White Walkers that lurked further in the darkness. But the immediate threat at this portion of the line waned. Jon turned to Ygritte, chest heaving from exertion. She met his gaze, her expression fierce and triumphant, though her face was drawn with pain. Tormund roared his approval and spat on the ground where the walker had vanished. "Ygritte!" he cried, voice booming. "That was a bloody fine shot, spearwife. Remind me never to cross you." She barked a short laugh that quavered with exhaustion. "Don't need reminding, Tormund." Men around them cheered, their spirits buoyed by the sight of a White Walker's defeat, but the battle was far from won. In the distance, more pale shapes moved, and the unearthly howls echoed through the swirling snow. 2 more White Walkers had been sighted, and pockets of Whites continued their assault on the flanks. At least now, the center line was not threatened by that first monstrous presence. Jon wiped sweat from his brow, though the cold made his skin burn. He scanned the battlefield. "We push forward, form a wedge, and break through," he shouted. "Archers, focus on any White Walker you see. Everyone else, clear the Whites. Burn what you can." the improvised command structure sprang to life. Free folk and black brothers alike converged on the flanks, leaving the center to a smaller force who would hold in case more undead circled around. The swirl of fighting became scattered pockets of conflict, each side lit by the dancing flames of torches and braziers. The air was thick with ash, the tang of iron, and the acrid stench of charred corpses. Ygritte, her quiver nearly empty, quickly gathered additional dragonglass arrows from a fallen archer. She tested them, cursing when she found some had cracked from the intense cold. She took what she could and pressed onward, ignoring the throbbing in her shoulder. For an instant, she had a flash of memory. The day she had nearly died at Castle Black, an arrow lodged in her own flesh. If she had perished then, none of this would be happening. The free folk might have been slaughtered wholesale, or maybe the Night's Watch would have been overrun. Fate, or something like it, had spared her, and now her arrow had ended a White Walker. She swallowed, letting that realization fuel her resolve. Rallied by victory, the living forced the Whites back step by step. Tormund led a furious charge on the left, joined by a band of spearwives who leapt over the churned snow to pierce any White that struggled to rise. On the right, the Mormont and Karstark men locked shields, systematically burning the corpses. And in the center, Jon and Ygritte formed a smaller unit with the most skilled rangers and free folk hunters, seeking out any sign of the remaining White Walkers. They didn't have to wait long. A second walker appeared, accompanied by a half-dozen Whites. Unlike its companion, this one brandished a thin, ice-blade sword that glowed a sickly pale. Its eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence as it assessed the living warriors. Jon yelled for the archers to target it, but it moved fast, almost as if it glided across the snow. The Whites fanned out, harassing the men from multiple angles, forcing them to break formation. Jon met the walker's gaze and recognized a terrifying cunning there. This creature knew the living forces had a weakness for those among them who still clung to older grievances, who might not fight cohesively in the swirl of chaos. With a silent gesture of its blade, it directed the Whites to sow confusion. Sure enough, a cluster of newly awakened undead lunged at a pair of black brothers who had drifted too far from the main group. Their screams were short-lived, echoing across the valley. Gritting his teeth, Jon shouted for Tormund or Ygritte, but they were both engaged elsewhere. He had no choice but to face this walker, trusting that the men around him would hold their own. Again, Longclaw rang out against the ice blade. Frost spread up the Valyrian steel with each impact, cracking off as Jon forced the walker to parry. The walker's strength was enormous, each blow jarring Jon's arms. He struggled to maintain his footing in the churned, blood-stained snow. Ygritte managed to spot the duel. She tried to line up a shot, but the swirling press of Whites made it impossible to get a clear angle. Worse, a pair of the undead took notice of her, lunging forward with predatory speed. She fired a quick arrow at one, striking it through the skull, but the second managed to seize her by the waist, bony fingers gripping with unnatural strength. She let out a gasp as icy cold seeped through her furs. Her dagger was pinned against her side, leaving her bow useless at close range. Snarling, Ygritte summoned what strength she had left and stomped hard on the White's leg, trying to break free. The creature's grip loosened for a heartbeat, and she twisted away, ignoring the tearing pain in her shoulder. Her dagger found the White's neck in a vicious upward thrust. The thing went limp, though its mouth still gaped soundlessly. She shoved it aside, trying to catch her breath. Amidst the maelstrom, Jon's duel with the walker came to a crescendo. With a defiant yell, he forced the creature's blade aside and slashed at its midsection. The walker recoiled, but Longclaw nicked its icy skin, leaving a jagged crack. The creature howled, an unearthly sound that made living warriors cringe. Seizing the opening, Jon struck again, aiming higher. But this time, the walker twisted and brought its sword down to block. The force of the parry sent a jolt through Jon's arms, nearly knocking Longclaw from his hands. Ygritte wanted to help, but every time she tried to move toward Jon, another White appeared, forcing her to defend herself. She cursed the fact that so many of their archers had been scattered. Then she remembered, the Watchers on the ridge. A handful of men with longbows still held position there, offering covering fire. She whistled sharply, a free folk signal for aid, hoping to draw their attention to the walker locked in combat with Jon. One of the Watchers, a lanky Night's Watch ranger named Orphan, spotted her signal and drew his bow. From his vantage, he had a partial line of sight on the walker. Carefully, he aimed a dragonglass arrow and loosed it. The arrow whizzed overhead, passing so close to Jon's head that he felt the wind of its flight. The walker jerked sideways and the arrow narrowly missed its chest, lodging instead in its shoulder. A crack formed at the point of impact, not enough to shatter the walker outright, but enough to stagger it. Jon wasted no time. He lunged forward, raising Longclaw high, and brought it down with all his might on the walker's flank. The Valyrian steel bit deep, aided by the arrow's partial fracture. A shriek resonated. The walker lurched, eyes flaring bright, and then it shattered in a burst of icy shards, collapsing into a pile of frost. Jon fell to one knee, panting, the cold sapping his strength. As the second walker perished, more wights dropped in place like puppets with their strings cut. Some continued fighting, though, indicating there was yet another walker out there, or else the magic animating them lingered. Jon pushed himself up, scanning desperately for Ygritte. He caught sight of her fending off one more wight, plunging her dagger repeatedly into its chest until it stopped twitching. Blood stained her furs. Most of it wasn't hers, but Jon's heart still lurched at the sight. He moved toward her, stepping over the bodies that littered the field. Together, they finished off any wights that still moved, with the help of Tormund's group on the left flank. At last, a semblance of stillness settled over the valley. The wind howled, carrying the fading moans of dying men. Fires crackled, the only real light left in this dark expanse. Haggard survivors stumbled among the corpses, searching for the wounded. Everywhere lay broken weapons, trampled banners, and the mangled remains of undead and living alike. Jon and Ygritte found each other amid that chaos. He examined her quickly, relief flooding him to see only minor cuts and bruises. She shook her head, breath steaming in the cold. "I'm all right," she murmured, voice trembling from exhaustion. "We did it." He glanced around, nodding numbly. "We broke their assault here, but they'll be back. The undead don't tire, and there may be more walkers leading other contingents." Nearby, Tormund spat in the snow, then looked up with a fierce grin. "We sent 2 of those icy bastards to their graves. I'll take that as a victory any day." But then his expression sobered as he surveyed the dead. "We lost so many, bloody crows and free folk alike." Jon couldn't deny it. The cost had been high, and this was only one battle in what promised to be a war. Still, the survivors had shown that cooperation was not only possible but necessary. Without the free folk archers, the Watch might have been overrun. Without the Night's Watch discipline, the wildling flank might have collapsed. Without the northern houses' pikes and fires, the undead would have spread across the entire valley unimpeded. Each group's contribution had been crucial. The living spent the rest of the night, if such darkness could be called night, gathering their wounded and burning the enemy's remains. Carts were fashioned from salvaged wood to carry the injured back to Castle Black or to a temporary encampment near the wall. Snow continued to drift, covering the carnage in a silent, pale shroud. Exhausted men and women trudged back in somber lines, some leaning on each other for support. A few free folk insisted on building pyres for their fallen kin, chanting old songs of farewell to the spirits. The Black Brothers said their own rites for the dead, quiet words swallowed by the wind. Ygritte and Jon oversaw the grim tasks. They made sure no wight was left unburned. A single overlooked corpse could rise again. Each time a pile of the dead went up in flames, the flickering light revealed the anguish on the survivors' faces. But it also revealed a shared sense of purpose. For a moment, the differences between wildling and crow, Northman and spearwife, all seemed meaningless compared to the common fight for existence. Once the field was as secure as it could be, Jon ordered a slow withdrawal to Castle Black. They needed to regroup to tend the wounded, Some wanted to push onward, seeking to rout any straggling undead, but caution prevailed. If more White Walkers lurked in the darkness, it would be suicide for a battered, weary force to chase them. Tormund agreed, though his fiery spirit chafed at the thought of retreat. Ygritte, for her part, had used nearly all her arrows and nursed an aching shoulder. She knew they had no choice. They marched back in grim silence. The line was shorter now, too many had fallen. Yet the sense of unity remained. Free folk supported black brothers who limped. Northern knights accepted canteens of water from spearwives. The old hatreds felt small in the face of what they had seen. Even so, they all knew that this had been only the beginning. The true horde was said to be even larger, directed by an unknown number of White Walkers, maybe even the fabled Night King that some spoke of in hushed tones. Castle Black came into view hours later, a dark silhouette against the endless whiteness, illuminated by the fires along the battlements. Word of the battle must have reached them, as the gates were thrown open and men rushed out to greet the returning column. Samwell Tarly was among them, his face ashen with worry until he spotted Jon. Despite the chaos, Sam's gaze flitted nervously around for Ygritte, too, relieved to see her alive. When the battered warriors finally crossed the threshold of Castle Black's courtyard, the stench of blood and smoke accompanied them like a shroud. Maester Aemon's old infirmary staff was gone. He himself had passed some time ago, but a new contingent of healers had been brought up from the south, along with some free folk knowledgeable in herb lore. They bustled about, triaging the injured. The moans of pain echoed in the corridors, while the walls of the keep flickered with torchlight. Stannis's men, those few who remained at Castle Black, watched grimly. They too knew that the real war was yet to come. Jon and Ygritte saw to it that the wounded found beds or pallets of straw. They worked side by side, helping to lift stretchers, soothing those too far gone to speak. Despite their exhaustion, they pressed on. Finally, near dawn, though it was hard to discern the sun through the heavy clouds, they collapsed in Jon's chamber. A battered table, a small hearth, a single bunk. It was hardly a place for rest, but it was better than the cold courtyard. Ygritte sank onto the bunk, leaning her bow against the wall. She clutched her shoulder, wincing. The scuffle with the White had reopened part of her old wound, and blood had soaked through her bandages. Jon knelt before her, gently peeling away the wet furs to examine the injury. Concern shadowed his dark eyes. "You should have said something," he murmured. "I'll fetch one of the healers." She shook her head fiercely. "Tend to it yourself, Jon Snow. I'm not keen on letting some Southron master poke at me with his fancy instruments." There was an edge of humor in her voice, but also weariness. Jon pressed his lips together, deciding not to argue. He retrieved a bowl of warm water, some clean cloth, and a small jar of salve the healers used. Carefully, he cut away the bloodied bandages. Ygritte hissed as the cold air touched the wound. Her skin was swollen and raw around the scar, the scab torn from her earlier exertions. Guilt gnawed at Jon. How many times had she risked herself in these battles, all because she had chosen to stand by him? He cleaned the wound as gently as he could, his hands oddly steady despite the day's events. Ygritte watched him, her eyes half-lidded from fatigue. Now and then, she tensed in pain, but she did not flinch away. Their closeness in that moment felt both fragile and fiercely intimate. By the time Jon finished bandaging her anew, her breathing had steadied somewhat, though the lines of pain lingered in her face. He pulled a threadbare blanket over her shoulders. "Get some sleep," he said softly. She grabbed his wrist before he could step away. "Not without you," she muttered. Then, with a half-smile that was equal parts exhaustion and fondness, she tugged him closer. He hesitated. There was still so much to do. Battle reports to give, the next moves to plan, the men's morale to bolster. But in that moment, the weight of command felt crushing. He surrendered to her pull, sitting down beside her on the narrow bunk. They leaned against each other in silence, the warmth of their bodies a bulwark against the cold seeping in through the stone. Jon brushed a stray lock of her red hair aside. Outside the window slit, the sky remained a sullen gray. He wondered, not for the first time, if dawn would ever truly break in this endless winter. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them both, and they fell into a restless sleep, fully clothed, sharing what little comfort they had. When Jon awoke, it was well into the day, though the sun offered no warmth. He slipped from the bunk carefully, trying not to disturb Ygritte. She stirred anyway, blinking bleary eyes at him. For a moment, they regarded each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Ygritte shifted and tested her shoulder, wincing. "Better," she said, though the word was forced. Jon wanted to protest, but he knew there was no time for coddling. The courtyard would be stirring. He strapped on his sword belt and offered her a hand. She took it, hauling herself up. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing the battered leathers and furs beneath. She tugged them back into place, swallowing a grimace as the motion pulled at her wound. Then the two of them stepped out into the corridor. The castle hummed with frenetic activity. Runners and messengers crossed paths, bearing tidings from the Southern Lords or from Eastwatch. The newly arrived healers rushed to gather more supplies: bandages, potions, rudimentary medical instruments. Smoke still curled from the knight's funeral pyres outside. The smell hung in the corridors, clinging to clothes and hair. "Jon Snow!" a gruff voice boomed. Tormund stomped over, wearing a fresh bandage on his forearm. "The men are wanting to know what's next. The crows are edgy, fearful the White Walkers will come again tonight. My lot's still ready to fight, but we need rest and warm food. We're not dead yet, but close to it." Despite his words, Tormund's spirit hadn't dimmed entirely. He slapped Jon on the back, his mouth twisting into something akin to a grin. "Not a bad scrap last night. Reminded me of the old days, raiding along the coast. Except for the whites, mind you." Jon mustered a faint smile. "Glad you're still in one piece, Tormund. We'll see about feeding everyone. I'll speak to the quartermaster. And thank you. I wouldn't have survived without you." Tormund dismissed the thanks with a wave. "Bah, I only took the walker's arm. Ygritte did the rest of the work. Spearwives, always saving the day." He gave Ygritte a nod of respect, and she tilted her head in acknowledgement, hiding any pride she might have felt behind a stoic mask. They convened a brief council in the common hall, where exhausted men slurped thin stew from wooden bowls. Davos Seaworth was there. He had arrived with a portion of Stannis's knights while the battle raged, too late to partake but soon enough to see the aftermath. His weathered face was lined with worry. "Your report is disturbing," he told Jon quietly. "If the White Walkers are this active, we're running out of time. Stannis wants to take his army south for his claim, but the winter storms have made movement nearly impossible. Even if he could march, would it be wise to leave the wall underdefended?" Jon rubbed his temples. The lack of sleep made his thoughts sluggish. "We have no good options, Ser Davos. The Free Folk, the Watch, and a handful of Northern Lords can't hold off the entire undead horde indefinitely. We need more men, more steel, and more dragonglass. Winter is only strengthening the walkers, if we don't gather enough forces or find a way to push them back for good." He let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. Davos nodded, gloom settling in his eyes. "I'll send more ravens to the northern keeps, see if we can muster further support. But many lords are wary, or they're dealing with their own hardships. Harvests have been poor. Wolves prowl the forests. Houses might not see the threat as we do. Not yet." Tormund snorted. "Then they're fools. They'll believe when they see whites at their door." Ygritte, sitting beside Jon, tapped her fingers on the table. "Maybe we need to take the fight to them, show them the truth. Send a party of men, crows, and free folk to each northern stronghold, carrying proof of what we face." She paused, exhaling. "It's risky, but better than letting them sit idle while we freeze and die." Davos considered the idea. Carrying proof, such as capturing a white alive to display, that might be more trouble than it's worth. A black brother near them, Sorin, shuddered. "We tried that once, bringing a white hand south. It did not end well. The thing turned to dust by morning. We might not be able to keep a white intact long enough to show." Tormund's eyes gleamed mischievously. I can chop off its head and carry it in a sack. If it tries to bite, I'll just thump it. He laughed, but no one else joined in. The notion was too grim, too uncertain. Jon steered the conversation back to practicalities. If we can't bring a white, we can still bring eyewitness accounts, riders who saw them. We have lords here who can vouch for the truth. Men who fought at the valley last night. If we spread out, we may convince more houses to rally. Meanwhile, the Watch and the Free Folk continue building defenses here. We strengthen the wall. Keep watch for any sign of another major push from the undead. Ygritte nodded. And if the houses still don't believe, then at least we tried. We can't force them to see sense. They hashed out the details of who would go, who would stay. Davos agreed to lead a small embassy to key houses, House Glover, House Manderley in White Harbor if the roads allowed. Tormund offered to send a few wildling representatives, if only to show the lords that free folk were truly united in this fight. That alone was sure to raise eyebrows, but it might also underscore the gravity of the situation. After the council, men dispersed to tend to their tasks. Jon and Ygritte found a moment of relative quiet near the stables, where the free folk's shaggy horses shared space with northern mounts. She leaned against a wooden beam, massaging her bandaged shoulder with a pained grimace. Jon cast her a concerned glance. "You should be resting." She shook her head. "I'll rest when I'm dead, as Tormund says. We've got too much to do, and I want to do my part. When I'm idle, all I can think about is how many more might die next time, or about what happens if we fail." Her voice softened. "Jon Snow, I've never seen men, wildling or crow, fight like this before, united against something bigger than all our squabbles. It feels like we're on the edge of a new world, one that could be shaped from the ashes, or one that might never be born at all if we fall." He followed her gaze. A handful of free folk children were peering through the stable slats, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. They'd lost family in the crossing. They had nowhere else to go. Jon felt a pang in his chest, recalling how many orphans had been made already. How many more would be if the undead advanced unchecked? "We have to give them a chance," he said quietly, eyes on the children. "It's why we keep fighting, no matter how desperate things get." She rested a hand on his arm. "That's why I'm here. I told you I wouldn't leave you to do this alone." They stood like that for a brief, stolen moment. Then Samwell appeared, pudgy cheeks flushed from running. He bobbed his head apologetically. "Jon, Ygritte, sorry to interrupt, but the new recruits for the Watch have arrived. Some stragglers from Mole's Town, a few from White Harbor. They need to be sworn in or at least processed. The acting first steward wants your input. Also, the free folk leaders want to talk about how to distribute the next shipment of grain." Jon sighed, a resigned look passing over his face. "All right, Sam, let's go." Ygritte gave a rueful smile. "Go on, Lord Commander. I'll see about the grain. Tormund and I can make sure it gets where it's needed most. Just try not to make the new recruits kneel for you." He huffed a soft laugh. "I'm not that kind of lord, you know." She winked, then left to track down Tormund. Jon and Sam made their way to the courtyard where the recruits waited. It was a ragtag group. Boys too young to swing a sword properly, old men seeking a last place to belong, a few criminals who likely chose the Watch over punishment. In times past, Jon might have tried to maintain the Watch's traditions strictly, but these were desperate days. Every able body could mean the difference between life and death when the walkers returned. He went through the motions, noting each recruit's name and reason for joining. He recognized fear in their eyes. After the oath was spoken, some reciting it from memory, others stumbling through the words with Sam's prompting, Jon offered them the usual admonishment. "The Night's Watch is your home now. We stand together or we fall." He didn't bother with the old hostility toward women or the free folk. Times had changed, and some of the new recruits were wildlings themselves, men who had decided the Black Cloak was preferable to starving in the cold. A few older brothers groused about it, but none dared gainsay Jon openly. Not after the battles they'd seen him lead. By mid-afternoon, The dull gray of the sky had shifted into a darker gloom. Another storm was rolling in, threatening to blanket the wall in fresh snow. Jon stood at the top of the stairs near the courtyard, surveying the keep. Repairs were ongoing from the last wildling assault, and more sections of the ramparts had been reinforced with sharpened stakes and braziers for quick access to flame. Despite the activity, an air of grim expectation hung over everyone. The White Walkers had attacked once and could do so again at any moment. As if on cue, a horn blast sounded from the western watchtower, one long note. Jon's heart lurched. One blast signified rangers returning, or friendly forces. 2 signified wildlings or sometimes other signals. 3 was the dreaded sign of White Walkers. But this time only one echoed. Men and women alike paused in their tasks, straining to see who approached. Soon, a handful of riders emerged from the swirling snow, weaving through the open gates. A ragged band of free folk scouts, escorting a tall, fur-clad figure. Jon recognized the color of the cloak, dark brown, trimmed with black. Karstark man, perhaps. The Karstarks had joined the cause, though grudgingly. The man slid off his horse, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. The free folk scouts gestured urgently, beckoning Jon over. Jon hastened to them, Sam at his heels. The Karstark soldier's eyes were wild. "My Lord Commander," he gasped, half bowing. "We were posted near the Queen's Gate. A large group of whites. They attacked us at dusk. We barely escaped. They're heading this way, we think. Maybe a few hours behind us." A ripple of alarm passed through those who heard. Queen's Gate was one of the small outposts along the wall, not far from Castle Black. If whites were already moving there, they'd be at Castle Black's doorstep by nightfall. And if the White Walkers commanded them, the battle would be ferocious. Jon stepped forward, gripping the man's shoulder. "How many?" The soldier's face turned ashen. "Scores, at least. Possibly hundreds. We were only a dozen men. Couldn't hold them. We fled." Jon looked around, catching the eyes of Tormund Ygritte, who was hurrying over upon hearing the commotion, and several black brothers. The meaning was plain. They had to ready themselves for another fight. They'd barely finished burying and burning their dead from the last one. Ygritte arrived, eyes flicking between Jon and the Karstark soldier. "Is it them?" she asked. "More whites." Jon nodded grimly. "On the move. Possibly tonight." He raised his voice, addressing all who could hear, including the new recruits. "Sound the alarm. We reinforce the gates. Prepare the ramparts. Archers to the walls. Get the dragon glass. Heat up oil. We do the same as before, but we make sure every man, every woman knows their part. Anyone who can fight stands ready. Anyone who can't, take shelter deeper in the keep." A flurry of activity erupted. Horns sounded anew, and a wave of tension rippled through the fortress. The men of the watch moved to their posts, clutching weapons in numb hands. Free folk gathered in the courtyard, checking bows and spears. Northern knights formed up outside the armory, retrieving helms and chain mail. The air buzzed with frantic energy, half terror, half determination. Moments later, Stannis Baratheon himself appeared in the courtyard, accompanied by Melisandre, the Red Woman. She wore her characteristic red robes, the color stark against the snowy backdrop, her face set in an inscrutable mask. Stannis surveyed the commotion with a harsh glare. "Lord Snow," he called, "I've just been informed. Undead at Queen's Gate." Jon inclined his head. Yes, they could arrive by nightfall. Stannis clenched his jaw, then glanced at Melisandre. She said nothing, only meeting Jon's eyes with her unsettling crimson gaze. After a tense pause, Stannis turned back to Jon. "I have knights waiting at Eastwatch, but the storm has blocked the road. We can't rely on reinforcements. We have what we have here." His tone was stiff, but Jon sensed a grim acceptance in the king's voice. Stannis might dream of conquering the south, but if Castle Black fell, his campaign was over before it began. Jon made a decision. "We'll hold them at the gate, use the corridors of the wall if needed. It won't be easy, but it's better than letting them swarm the courtyard again. He glanced at Ygritte, Tormund, and Sam. Spread the word. We hold the main gate with archers and pikes. If they get inside, we fight them in close quarters. Use fire and dragonglass. Stannis, any men you can spare. Stannis raised a hand, cutting him off. You'll have them, Lord Snow. This is a foe we cannot afford to ignore. The realm depends on us. He hesitated, as if about to say more, then strode away, barking orders at his attendants. Melisandre lingered, her red eyes roving over Jon and Ygritte. For a brief moment, she appeared to study Ygritte closely, as if seeing something invisible to others. A cryptic smile touched her lips. The flames show many things, she murmured, voice soft but penetrating. Worry not. This night has not yet been written. Then she turned and drifted away, leaving behind an uneasy hush. Ygritte shivered, rubbing her arms. That red woman gives me the chills more than any White Walker, she muttered to Jon. She's always watching with those eyes of hers. Jon had no reply. He suspected Melisandre's powers were real, but also that they came with unknown costs. Now was not the time to dwell on that. He nodded grimly and led the way back to the ramparts, where they surveyed the approach. Below, men scurried about, stacking barrels of oil and pitch, ready to be ignited. Some hammered fresh stakes into the earth. The hiss of whetstones sharpening blades underscored the sense of urgency. Night crept in. The sky turned a bruised purple, then nearly black, as the storm clouds thickened. The watchers on the wall strained to see any motion in the distance. Torches flickered, forming dancing halos of light on the snowy ground. Occasionally, the wind would shift, carrying the echo of a distant moan or clatter, though it was hard to separate real sounds from the illusions of a fearful mind. Within Castle Black, the tension felt like a coiled spring. Ygritte moved among the free folk archers, offering quick words of encouragement, ensuring they each had dragonglass-dipped arrows. Tormund double-checked the pike lines, barking that any man who fled would answer to his axe. Samwell stood with Gilly, who clutched her baby tightly. He tried to reassure her, though his own voice trembled. In the towers, the hornsmen waited, ready to blast warning if the undead were sighted. And Jon stood at the gate, sword at his side, recalling every battle he had fought, every victory and every defeat. This might be the largest test yet. At last it happened. The horn sounded 2 long notes, then 3. The watchers had glimpsed them. A seething mass of silhouettes cresting the ridge, pale arms, twisted limbs, glowing eyes. The undead marched in force. Shouts rang out, men dashed to final positions. Fire arrows were lit. The archers began loosing volley after volley at the horde advancing on Castle Black. Some wights fell, flaming, thrashing in the snow, but more kept coming, unstoppable. Ygritte perched on the rampart, her bow drawn. She aimed carefully, ignoring the throbbing pain in her shoulder, and fired at the densest cluster of wights. Her arrow ignited 2 or 3 who crumpled. Other archers did the same, a veritable rain of fire descending on the wights. The ground below flickered with flames, and thick smoke billowed upward. But in the swirling gloom, it was difficult to see how many enemies truly advanced. Jon cursed under his breath. "We hold them at the gate," he shouted. But deep down he worried the gate wouldn't be enough if the undead were as numerous as reported. The entire wall might be tested. Once again, the memory of Hardhome haunted him. A vision of the dead rising in waves too vast to count. Tormund roared from a nearby platform, "Pour the oil! Burn them all!" Men heaved barrels over, and scalding pitch rained down on the wights. Flames erupted, bathing the courtyard below in a hellish glow. Screeches tore through the night. Ygritte kept firing as fast as she could, each arrow a small prayer that the wights would not breach the gate. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. The fury of battle consumed them. The gate shook under the weight of undead pounding. Gnarled hands clawed through iron bars, snapping at any living flesh in reach. Some wights tried to scale the walls, heedless of the arrows that skewered them. Piles of burning corpses littered the base, yet more always crawled forward. On the ramparts, the archers slowly ran out of arrows, forced to draw blades and hack at wights that managed to climb. Jon carved through 2 wights that made it over the wall, panting as the cold air tore at his lungs. Longclaw glimmered with icy residue each time it clashed with undead flesh. Nearby, a free folk warrior toppled backward with a scream, a wight clinging to his chest. Jon lunged, severing the wight's spine. The warrior slumped, saved from the monster's teeth but badly mauled. Ygritte found herself in the thick of it, too. A cluster of wights managed to scramble onto a walkway by forming a makeshift ladder of their own bodies, climbing over each other's backs. She and 3 others formed a desperate defense, stabbing at each wight that hauled itself up. The stench of rot and burning oil choked them. One wight lunged at Ygritte's legs, nearly throwing her off balance. She stomped on its skull, burying a dragonglass knife in what remained of its face. Amid the chaos, a piercing shriek rose from below. A white walker had emerged, standing amidst the horde. It lifted an icy blade, and frost spread across the scorched ground, snuffing out some of the flames. In an instant, the undead that had been flailing in the fires ceased to burn, rising again to join the assault. Horror spread along the ramparts. The cunning of this creature threatened to undo all their defenses. Even from the wall, Jon felt the temperature plummet. The White Walker locked its glowing blue eyes on the gate. With an inhuman fluidity, it slashed the air, sending a gust of cold that cracked the iron bars. The men stationed there recoiled. If that gate broke, the fortress would be overwhelmed. Jon shouted, "Focus the fire on the walker. Bring it down." But only a handful of archers had the vantage and the arrows left to aim. Ygritte glimpsed the walker from her position and tried to draw a bead on it, but the surging wights blocked her line of sight. She spat a furious curse. Another wave of wights scaled the walls, forcing the defenders to engage in brutal close-quarters combat. Tormund's voice bellowed somewhere to her left, urging men to stand firm. Swords rang, men screamed, the dead shrieked. Smoke and snow mingled, turning everything into a swirling maelstrom of horror. The White Walker below raised its blade again. This time, the gate groaned ominously. Shards of ice formed along the iron bars, creeping like hungry vines, fracturing the metal from within. In seconds, the bars snapped with a resounding crack. A collective cry of dismay echoed from the defenders. Jon's heart pounded. They were about to lose the gate. Even if they poured more oil, the White Walker's frost could neutralize it. He had to act. He beckoned to a handful of archers. "With me!" he shouted, then began descending the steps, weaving through the chaotic crowd. Ygritte saw him go, her eyes widening. She shot a wight that lunged for him, skewering it through the back. He spared her a quick, grateful nod before continuing down. Reaching the courtyard, he found it partially ablaze. Corpses littered the ground, some still aflame, some writhing. The White Walker stood at the smashed gate, a poised specter of ice. Behind it, an endless tide of wights surged. The situation was dire. If that wave poured in, Castle Black would become a slaughterhouse. Jon and the archers spread out. "Aim for the walker," he commanded, voice hoarse. A volley flew, but the White Walker flicked its blade, conjuring a swirl of frost that shattered most arrows mid-flight. One or two found their mark but skittered harmlessly off the walker's icy hide. It advanced, each step an executioner's drumbeat. Rallying, Jon rushed forward, ignoring the fear clawing at his mind. Longclaw gleamed in the firelight. He hurled himself at the walker with a downward slash, hoping to replicate the success he'd had before. But the walker was ready. It parried with its blade, sparks of frost crackling where Valyrian steel met ice. A shockwave of cold spread along Jon's arms, numbing them. He hissed, stepping back. The walker pressed forward, delivering a series of fluid strikes that forced Jon on the defensive. Each impact sent jolts of pain through Jon's bones. He stumbled, nearly losing his footing on a patch of frozen slush. The walker raised its blade in a final, lethal arc. Jon braced for the blow, bringing Longclaw up to block, though he knew it might not be enough. Suddenly, the walker let out a shriek. An arrow protruded from its shoulder, dragonglass, glowing with the reflection of the fires. The walker reeled, its attack momentarily halted. Jon blinked in shock, then glanced back to see who had fired. Ygritte stood atop a broken section of the rampart, bow in hand, her fiery hair whipping in the wind. She'd made an impossible shot through the mass of whites. Seizing the moment, Jon lunged. He drove long, claw into the walker's chest, fracturing its frosty form. Cracks spiderwebbed from the entry point, and with a second shriek, the walker disintegrated in a burst of icy shards. Nearby whites spasmed and collapsed, though plenty more remained in the courtyard and beyond, bound perhaps to other walkers. "Fall back! Fall back!" Tormund roared from the walls, realizing the gate was lost. The defenders scrambled to set up a second line deeper within the keep, using barricades of wood and stone. If the whites got past that line, the entire fortress would be undone. Ygritte hopped down from her vantage, wincing as she landed. She pushed past a pair of black brothers who were retreating, her mind set on finding Jon. Smoke filled her lungs, but she pressed on. Through the swirling chaos, she spotted him in the courtyard, dispatching a white that still writhed near the remains of the walker. "Jon!" she called, breath ragged. "We have to get inside. We can't hold the courtyard now." He nodded, chest heaving. All around them, men fought and died, struggling to contain the tide of undead. With the walker's demise, part of the wave had gone still, but more whites pressed in from the shattered gate. Jon and Ygritte darted back, hacking at any undead that lunged in their path. Their boots slipped on slick patches of ice, but they managed to keep upright. A group of northern knights formed a protective ring around them, shields raised, spears jabbing. Tormund led a contingent of free folk in a last, desperate stand near the stables, trying to keep the undead from flanking them. Ygritte looked desperately for a path to the interior corridor that led up the wall stairs. If they could regroup there, maybe they stood a chance of holding the upper levels. Just as they neared that corridor, a massive shape burst through a side entrance, a white that had once been a giant. At nearly 12 feet tall, it lumbered forward, half its face rotted away, one eye glowing a fierce blue. It swept a tree trunk of a club across the courtyard, smashing aside men and whites alike in its blind fury. The defenders scattered, shouting warnings. Jon cursed. If that undead giant reached the corridor, it would break any barricade they set up. Tormund, spotting the creature, howled in rage. "That's one's kin," he muttered. Though whether it was truly a relative or just another giant, none could say. Tormund charged, followed by 3 free folk. But the giant white turned, swinging its massive club. One blow shattered Tormund's companions, flinging them like rag dolls. Tormund himself barely ducked, the wind of the swing knocking him to the ground. Ygritte's bow was nearly empty of arrows, and those she had left were standard tips, not dragonglass. She cursed, glancing at Jon. "We need obsidian for that thing, or else fire." Jon nodded, scanning the courtyard. A barrel of oil sat near a collapsed brazier. He sprinted toward it, signaling Ygritte to follow. She covered him, firing arrows at any whites that threatened to intercept. He reached the barrel, thrust a torch into its open top, and kicked it over in the giant's direction. Flames exploded, setting the ground ablaze, but the giant white stomped through the fire with a hideous roar, only slightly slowed. Without warning, the giant lunged for Jon with a massive hand. Jon barely threw himself aside, tumbling in the snow. Flames licked at the edges of the giant's fur, but it did not catch fully. Ygritte darted around, trying to line up a shot to the giant's head or neck, but the chaos of the courtyard made a clear shot impossible. Tormund, back on his feet, rushed in again with his dragonglass axe, aiming for the giant's leg. He hacked once, and a chunk of putrid flesh came away, but the giant's momentum carried it forward, and Tormund had to dive aside to avoid being trampled. Then Ygritte spotted a battered ballista near the stables, likely hauled down from the wall's ramparts at some point. "John!" she shouted, pointing. "We can use that." He nodded, sprinting toward the ballista with her. It was old, the gears stiff from the cold, but it might be enough. A single heavy bolt lined with dragonglass could pierce even giant bones. Ygritte helped him crank the mechanism, her breath ragged. John shoved a dragonglass-dipped bolt into place. They aimed as best they could, but the giant wight kept lurching and thrashing, making it difficult to predict its movements. "I'll distract it," Tormund roared, catching on to their plan. The big free folk leader bounded forward, waving his arms and hurling insults, trying to draw the giant's attention. The wight turned, rotting face twisted in an almost animalistic snarl, and swiped at Tormund. Tormund jumped back, giving Ygritte and Jon a brief opening. "Now!" Jon shouted. He and Ygritte released the ballista's tension. The bolt flew with a resounding twang, cutting through the smoky air. For a heartbeat, it seemed the shot would go wide. Then the giant stumbled, and the bolt struck home, burying itself in the creature's chest, right where its heart should be. A deafening bellow erupted from the giant wight, shaking the very stones of Castle Black. It flailed, arms swiping wildly. Then cracks spread from the impact point, and the wight toppled to its knees, letting out one final groan before collapsing in a heap of decayed flesh. A plume of dust and snow rose, and the light in its single blue eye winked out. Cheers erupted from the defenders who saw the giant fall. The tide was turning. With the White Walker destroyed and the giant down, the Whites lost much of their coordination. Though many still fought, pockets of the living gradually cornered and burned them. Tormund and his free folk roamed the courtyard, finishing off stragglers. Stannis' knights pressed in, methodically lighting pyres. Exhausted beyond measure, Jon and Ygritte collapsed against the ballista, trying to catch their breath. The night wore on, but the onslaught had finally slowed. The battered gate area was beyond repair, but at least no more wights poured in. Whether that meant the undead horde had retreated or was destroyed was unclear. Fires flickered everywhere, and though fresh snow began to fall, it could not erase the night's devastation. As dawn approached, a pale gray light seeped through the clouds. The living took stock of their losses. Dozens more dead, maybe hundreds. Castle Black itself had been shaken to its foundations. Walls cracked, gates smashed, courtyards charred. Yet the defenders remained, battered but unbroken. The Black Brothers, Free Folk, Northern Knights, and Stannis' men stood side by side, wearing identical expressions of grim relief. Later, Ygritte and Jon, along with Tormund, Sam, and a handful of others, gathered in the yard near the smoldering remains of the giant wight. They were too weary to speak much. Tormund clapped Jon on the shoulder, murmuring something about a victory feast of roast goat if they ever found goats again. Ygritte just rested a hand on Jon's arm, her eyes reflecting a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She was thinking of how many more battles like this might lie ahead, and whether the living could endure them all. Jon looked around at the survivors, the faint winter dawn casting ghostly shadows over the devastation. Bodies had to be burned or buried, repairs needed to be made, and the threat was far from over. White Walkers still roamed the darkness beyond the wall, their undead armies an ever-present menace. Yet, in the midst of the wreckage, he saw something that gave him a scrap of hope. Men of the Night's Watch clasping arms with wildlings, knights standing next to spearwives, all grateful to be alive. This was the fragile peace he and Ygritte had fought so hard to forge. It was tested by the fires of battle, and though scorched, it had not broken. Ygritte leaned her head against Jon's shoulder for a moment, letting out a shaky breath. He wrapped an arm around her gently, mindful of her bandaged wound. For once, neither cared who might see. They had risked their lives for each other countless times over now, bridging once insurmountable divides. In that shared defiance of death, they found a sense of belonging more potent than any vow. Across the courtyard, a cluster of Black Brothers and Free Folk huddled over a steaming pot of stew, each man or woman taking a turn sipping. Over near the gate's shattered remains, Northern soldiers helped Tormund's people hoist timbers to form a makeshift barricade. Samwell aided the healers, giving instructions in a soft, steady tone that belied his own trembling hands. Stannis's banner drooped in the snowfall, but the men beneath it stood vigilant, their stern faces marred by soot and exhaustion. The ramifications of this victory, and it was a victory of sorts, would ripple across the north. Fewer enemies remained standing, and that alone might give them precious time. If word spread that yet another host of the dead had been beaten back, perhaps more lords would rally. Perhaps the tenuous alliance would grow stronger. Or perhaps the White Walkers would return in greater numbers, relentless as winter itself. But for now, they savored a moment of survival. Jon gently turned Ygritte's face toward him, meeting her gaze. "Thank you," he said, voice raw with sincerity. He meant thank you for the arrows that saved him, for refusing to walk away from this hopeless cause, for being the single ember of warmth in a world of ice and death. She set her jaw, a flicker of that old wildling spark in her eyes. "Don't go soft on me, Crow," she teased, though her tone was laced with relief. "There's still work to be done." He nodded, letting the corners of his mouth lift in a tired smile. "Aye, a lifetime's worth." They turned as Tormund approached, leaning on his axe like a walking stick. "We're not all dead yet," he grunted, scanning the battered fortress. "All your fancy vows and gates can't keep out the cold forever, Jon Snow. But maybe, just maybe, we'll find a way to outlast it if we keep standing shoulder to shoulder." He glanced pointedly at Ygritte, then back at Jon. "If anyone can do it, I suppose it's you too. Still, you might want to find a bigger bed. You'll be needing heirs if we survive all this." He laughed, a deep, booming sound that coughed into a wince. Perhaps he'd cracked a rib. Ygritte rolled her eyes. "Shut your giant's mouth, Tormund." But a small smile tugged at her lips, as if even the thought of a future beyond these battles warmed her spirit. Jon shook his head, chuckling softly, though the idea of planning for the future felt both terrifying and liberating. How strange that, in the midst of all this death, they still dared to imagine life beyond the long night. Yet that hope was precisely what drove them on. Before more words could be said, the cold wind lashed through the courtyard, scattering sparks from a nearby brazier. The moment of quiet reflection ended. There were wounded to tend, fresh defenses to build, and decisions to be made about how to best prepare for the next assault. Jon felt his back straighten, the weight of command pressing down anew. He exchanged a final look with Ygritte, unspoken understanding passing between them, then stepped forward, calling for the men. Together they would rebuild, fortify, and stand ready. They would gather allies, share what resources they could, and keep forging this unlikely peace with the North. Every day they endured was another day the living triumphed over the dead. Deep in his heart, Jon Snow no longer wrestled with the question of whether his love for Ygritte conflicted with his duty. He saw now that loving her, that uniting the Night's Watch and the Free Folk, was his duty. It was the only path left for survival. If dawn ever broke over this endless winter, it would shine on a realm changed by their defiance, where free folk and kneelers might stand side by side, owing no debt but that of shared humanity. And if, in the darkest hour, they could kindle even a single spark of hope, perhaps that alone would be enough to guide them toward the promise of a tomorrow where children laughed instead of cried, where men built homes instead of funeral pyres, and where a wildling woman and a black-cloaked crow could walk hand in hand beneath a sun that rose over a world that had, at long last, found peace.